Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike Alexander, and I'm the director of the Center for Livable Communities at the Atlanta Regional Commission. And I'll be kicking off today's webinar. ARC could not be more excited to welcome the Partnership for Southern Equity and the City of East Point to share about their great work organizing and advocating for equity and inclusion within our regional community. ARC has been partnering with PSC for many years, and they have been invaluable to our work, assisting us with facilitating discussions among regional leaders, advising us on equitable policies in both community development and our transportation arenas. We are happy to be continuing that work through this webinar series today. And let me say, now more than ever, Atlanta is fortunate to have an organization like PSC who has been doing the work on the ground, organizing in the American South now for the last 10 years. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce my friend Nathaniel Smith, Chief Equity Officer and the founder of the Partnership for Southern Equity. Under Nathaniel's guidance, PSC's regional engagement accomplishments include the creation of the American South's first equity mapping and framing tool, the Metro Atlanta Equity Atlas, and the organizing around the $13 million referendum that expanded Atlanta's Metropolitan Transit System, MARTA, into Clayton County. Prior to founding PSC, Nathaniel served as the Director of Partnerships and Research for Equitable Development at Emory University's Center for Community Partnerships, as a public policy manager at the Atlanta Neighborhood Development Partnership, and in numerous advisory capacities. He was recently selected as one of the 50 international leaders to participate in the inaugural German Marshall Fund's Bilbao Urban Innovation and Leadership Dialogues, BUILD, to discuss strategies for leading equitable growth in cities. A native of Atlanta, Smith holds a BA in Urban Studies from Morehouse College and a Master of Science degree from the Robert G. Milano School for Management and Urban Policy at the New School for Social Research. With that, Nathaniel.
Thank you so much, Mike. I appreciate that introduction. The Atlanta Regional Commission has been such a great friend of the Partnership for Southern Equity. And again, we're just so honored to have an opportunity to highlight the work of the Partnership for Southern Equity, and not just the what, but the way of advancing equity that we have chosen as an organization. And of course, we always like to elevate our friends when we have an opportunity. So we've asked Mayor Dina Holiday Ingram to the mayor of East Point to also participate in this conversation with us as well. And so now I will move forward with the presentation so we can get started. So as I've stated before, let's try this again, everybody. There we go. Let's try again. We're having a little technical difficulty. Okay. And what I may do for my supporters in this presentation, I may just ask if it is possible for us to move the next slide with your help. So today we will have a great panel of participants. Of course, I will be participating as the moderator. And again, my name is Nathaniel Smith, and I serve as the founder and chief equity officer of the Partnership for Southern Equity. You'll also hear from Chandra Farley, who leads our Just Energy portfolio, and you'll learn more about the work of Just Energy. as well as Suzanne Burns, who serves as the Director of Just Growth, our Just Growth portfolio, and as I mentioned before, Mayor Dina Holiday Ingram, who is the mayor of East Point. She will be talking a little bit about the work that we've had a chance to do with the city of East Point. Next slide. So I wanted to make sure that I also provided PSCs Mission. We consider ourselves a racial equity organization, and our commitment to the region and the South compels us to continue to work with our partners to advance policies and institutional actions that promote racial equity and shared prosperity for all in Metro Atlanta and the South. There are 4 primary areas that we focus on as an organization: just energy, just growth, just opportunity, and just health. And there are several tactics that we utilize to advance our racial equity agenda, whether it be through our organizing efforts on the ground and with our various partners that represent diverse sectors, our leadership development work, coalition building efforts, research and reporting, and last but certainly not least, the work that we do around authentic community engagement. Next slide. So in all of the work that we do, we are guided by a set of shared principles. And as to become a partner of the Partnership of Southern Equity, and in particular with our equity circles, you also have to embrace these principles of shared prosperity as we move forward to realizing a more inclusive and just region. And so our first principle that we believe in is that development must happen with people and not to people. Our second principle is that public and private investment should produce outcomes for people, planet, and profit. Third is that equitable growth is a superior growth model. And our fourth principle is that building capacity can enable communities to lead and own change efforts. Next slide. So as I discussed earlier, there is a unique way that we advance our work. We lead with race. We don't run from the history of structural racism and its effects on our region and state and nation, understanding that we must undo that original sin and how it has manifested itself within the context of our policy and our built environments, that we must work together to undo that. We believe in catalyzing relationships. We believe that relationships are the key to change, growing an ecosystem of change agents that are working with us to advance this work that we're doing. We also believe that the work must be grounded in communities of color and low wealth communities. We believe that the communities that are closest to the problems that we face in our society are also closest to the solutions. And so because of that, we want to make sure that they play a key part in our work in advancing equity. And of course, leading with data and research is critical for us in advancing this work. Next slide. So we also wanted to make sure in this presentation that we provided a clear definition of equity. It serves as our shared foundation as an organization. And the definition that we utilize is that we are working to create the conditions that enable just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. This is our guiding star as an organization, and our partners have also embraced this charge as well. Next slide. Just a quick snapshot into our leadership team. They consist of an incredible group of leaders who have committed to becoming a part of the Partnership of Southern Equity, along with our other staff and key leaders that are engaged in the organization. We work every day to ensure that our region and our state is moving towards equity as a society, not just through words, but also through partnerships strategy and actions. Next slide. So one of our key mantras as an organization actually comes from one of Georgia's greatest sons, and that is, of course, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He had a saying or a mantra that he lifted up during his letter from a Birmingham jail, and other areas where he talked about the network of mutuality. He said that we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And that is really what drives the Partnership for Southern Equity, to encourage the region to understand that we have a shared destiny as a region, and we must begin the process of working together to create a region that works for everyone. We can't afford to have prosperity on the north side while certain segments of the south side are suffering. What affects the south side affects what happens on the north side. We can't continue to have some of the challenges that we have on the west side and think that the east side is going to be able to move forward and be prosperous for the long haul. We all have to understand that we're connected, and we believe that Dr. King's belief in the network of mutuality, our shared destiny as a region, is a key compass for the work that is required as we move towards and through the 21st century. Next slide. So now I'm going to pass the ball off, so to speak, to Ms. Chandra Farley, who leads our Just Energy portfolio. Chandra.
Thanks so much, Nathaniel, and thanks again to the Atlanta Regional Commission for inviting us here for this conversation today. And to follow up on, the foundation of PSE and the foundation of our racial equity work, I'm going to talk about how our Just Energy work fits into that. Next slide. So when we talk about Just Energy, let's start with talking about what people think about energy and how people relate to energy. And sometimes the only really interaction that some people have with energy is through their utility bills. So as Partnership for Southern Equity was embarking on some work with the city of Atlanta around the adoption of the 100% clean energy plan over 2 years ago, after that we did a survey, and I was always really struck by this very first question, where how people feel about how energy decisions are being made with or without our most marginalized communities in mind. And so one of those questions, next slide, is really about, so how do we do this work and what does Just Energy mean? So when we talk about Just Energy, it's really a framework to advance energy equity. And our definition of energy equity is the fair distribution of the benefits and burdens of energy production and consumption. And so you can see that with the definition of energy equity and the way people are experiencing energy, utility, and climate decisions in their communities, these things don't really connect right now. Next slide. So at PSE, Nathaniel set us up to talk about the PSE way, the way that we do our work. And this is how we grow the energy equity ecosystem on the ground across Georgia and across the South as a whole. Through coalition building, our oldest racial equity coalition at PSE is the Just Energy Circle. Through community leadership development, we've modeled our Just Energy Academy, which is a 7-month leadership development program that is built upon our Transformation Academy, our Resident Leaders Academy. And so we have some of our foundational principles for the organization that we built off for Just Energy. So leadership and racial equity, community conflict resolution, organizing for opportunity, but also Energy Policy 101, utility regulatory structures here in Georgia with our Georgia Public Service Commission. It is elected and 2 seats are on the ballot this November. And continuing with that community leadership development focused on our youth and our young people, some in college, some not in college. So our Keep That Same Energy Youth Initiative is really focused on making sure that we are capturing not just the next generation, but those folks who are working right now, ages 16 to 24, doing the hard work of leading these social movements and making sure that there's a strong grounding in racial equity and why racial equity is important. And then through community engagement, our largest event happens every 2 years. We just wrapped up the Just Energy Summit virtually for the first time ever. We had over 500 folks register for that, which was our way and is always our way of bringing community and practitioners together, just like we do through our racial equity coalitions. And when we talk about civic leadership and civic engagement, our goals for the Just Energy Summit and all of our events is to have this ratio. So we focus on achieving a 70% to 30% ratio, 70% community to 30% practitioner. Understanding there's always some overlap there, as some of our most dependent on practitioners are officers of their NPUs, officers of their neighborhood associations, deacons at their church, and understanding that we value the technical expertise, the policy advocacy professionals, just as much as we value those who are bringing their lived experience as expertise to the table to inform how we approach our work and teach us how we should be following them as we focus on democratizing access to the energy planning and decision-making process. Next slide. So I talked about our Just Energy Circle, and I know my colleague Suzanne will talk about the Just Growth Circle. All of our 4 issue areas at PSC have this racial equity circle. And the Just Energy Circle is really all about being values driven, working together to make sure that we can not just vision, but take the actions that we need that are necessary to make sure that renewable, clean energy solutions and the emerging clean energy economy is accessible to everyone and that everyone can benefit. Next slide. And so these capture our shared values of the Just Energy Circle. And Nathaniel talked about some of the guiding principles of our organization. Well, we start all of our coalition work, all of our project work by coming together around a set of shared values and a collective vision. Because it's like, no matter what the issue is, if we're not all aligned on what our North Star is, where we ultimately want to go together and why we want to go that way together, we're always just going to hit the symptoms, right? We'll just be putting band-aids onto things. So these were the values put together by the founding members and community folks that came together to found the Just Energy Circle. And so that has been 7 years ago now, and we do revisit these. So we definitely have to take a look back. Our monthly Just Energy Circle meetings, they happen every 3rd Friday. They used to happen at the Fulton Atlanta Community Action Authority. Now we're virtual, but we do take time out of our meetings to, do these values still make sense? How are these values showing up in our work? How are these values showing up in our meeting conversations today? So for instance, we really talked about, does emerging green sector economy still make sense? The clean energy economy is here. It is rolling like a freight train, rolling right over some folks, right? So, which is one of the reasons that we agreed, yes, it is not necessarily emerging for everyone, but it is still definitely emerging, particularly for our communities of concern that we talk about at the Partnership for Southern Equity. Next slide. And so again, just to talk about how we do the work with the Just Energy Circle, we have 3 committees. We have a policy and advocacy committee, we have an education and action committee, and we have an energize and connect committee, which is essentially the organizing arm of the circle. So making sure people are out at our events, making sure people are telling their neighbors, bringing their friends, making announcements at their houses of worship. all to make sure that we're coming together to advance a more just and equitable clean energy future. Next slide. And these are just an example of all of our members. I like to say that we have a Noah's Ark approach to our membership with the Just Energy Circle. So for every quote unquote big green organization, so for Georgia, that would be like a state affiliate of a national organization, like a Sierra Club, or a United States Green Building Council. But we make sure that for every sort of big green organization that we're bringing on, that we're also bringing on a community or neighborhood-based organization, like one of our longtime partners from Marietta, the Georgia Community Coalition, Georgia Wand, Eco Action, to make sure that we're keeping that balance and that all our decision-making, all of our planning is constantly informed by and led by the voices of those who we know are first and most impacted by energy insecurities. We talk a lot about energy burden now, which is the percentage of household income spent on utilities. Atlanta is again at the top of that list in the nation for highest energy burdens. And so what are the actions that we can take, not just around energy, but that really trifecta of insecurity, which includes energy, food, and housing. And one of the reasons I always refer back to PSC's logo, the reason it is a circle, I think, is a perfect example of why our work is and has to be interconnected in the way that it is. Next slide. And so we like to also make sure that we've got tangible expressions of energy equity, right? Equity can be hard to touch. You know, we're learning, we're doing more learning around it. In the energy space, you know, we've got really good opportunities to show what a tangible expression of energy equity looks like. And I think this is best expressed in one of our current projects called Breaking Barriers, in partnership with the Atlanta University Center, Atlanta University Center Consortium, Spelman College, Morehouse College, and our partners, Groundswell, which is all about what does it look like to build out solar for this university community that is embedded in the surrounding neighborhoods, and also in one of the neighborhoods across the city of Atlanta and across Georgia, suffering under some of those highest energy burdens that I talked about. Agreed upon averages nationally are around 6%. And if you fall around that, you know, you're technically energy burdened. If you're over or at around 10%, then you're falling into energy poverty. Some of the neighborhoods in the zip codes that the Atlanta University Center falls in, and some of those surrounding neighborhoods, are upwards of 14, 15%. So when we are talking about opportunities to expand affordable housing, opportunities to better expand neighborhood development, it is these kinds of energy equity in action projects that are going to provide opportunities to not just experience and see these kinds of installations, but to learn alongside with them. So another great partnership with this project is actually a curriculum component at the Atlanta University Center, where students will also be learning alongside with community, organizing around this project to make sure that, next slide, that we are looking at this collaborative community development model, which has the community design. We've got our neighborhood planning unit representatives involved. We've got our organizers involved. We've got technical support on the actual solar and storage pieces, and then the curriculum design. So really a full ecosystem approach, the word we really love at PSE, about how to approach this work. And so I think this is my last slide, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Suzanne.
Thank you, Chandra. I think there was, let's see, yeah, good transition here in this equity is a way, not a what. Let's go to the next slide, please. So again, my name is Suzanne Burns. I'm so excited to be with you all today and appreciate the time to share a little bit about the work of the Just Growth portfolio. We focus on what we reference as equitable development. Increasingly, we're starting to hear the term democratizing development be something that feels very, very clear in capturing what we're all about. We are working to realize communities and regions where residents of all incomes, races, ethnicities can participate in and prosper from decisions that shape the places they live. So this really is about land use and about real estate and the way that land use and particularly the investments in infrastructure have impact on the communities where those investments are being made and the role that those communities do or don't have in driving those investments. And we think of those as being both public sector investments and private sector. We have a Just Growth Circle. So very similar to the basic structure that Chandra shared relating to just energy. In our case, we look at development from a very holistic standpoint. And we believe that we can't just have a conversation around affordable housing development and not include folks who are coming from communities, folks who are working on other types of infrastructure investment, whether they're transportation projects, parks or green space projects, water infrastructure projects. All of these types of investments have those impacts on community, and we want to transform the way that those investments are happening, and bringing together folks across those different spectrums we feel like is important in building the capacity and the courage and the connections that folks need to be able to do their jobs and play their role in the development process in a different and more equitable way. Next slide, please. Again, similar to the way that Chandra described the Just Energy Circle and their shared values, and as you heard, the values for shared prosperity that Nathaniel lifted up, the Just Growth Circle in its early stages back in 2016-17, the representatives who again come from community-based organizations, larger nonprofits, national nonprofits, local groups, as well as some representing the government sector. These folks came together, and these were the values that they felt strongly needed to be a part of what we consider to be just or equitable growth. So I think the really critical thing for me to emphasize here is that first top left corner, that anticipate and protect against displacement. And that's really what it all boils down to for us, is that we in the fields of development, real estate planning, infrastructure investments, again, whether they're public or private, have to come to a better understanding that investments will result in displacement if there are not protections put in place in advance of those projects, and things that are built into the lives of those projects from very early stages through the long-term life of those projects. There's just too much evidence at this point that the investment attracts more investment, and without protections, those who have been legacy residents of the community, who maybe have suffered from disinvestment over the years, will not be able to stay to enjoy the benefits of the new investment if those protections are not put in place. Next slide, please. So one thing that we talk about a good bit in Just Growth, and I think it also comes up in Just Energy conversations, is this idea of building capacity for equitable action during moments of opportunity. So what we mean by that is that, you know, when you look at the broad sort of spectrum of infrastructure in urban places, we have new infrastructure that is being developed all the time. We have old infrastructure that is ending its functional lifespan and being retired. And at any given time in any city, there are decisions being made related to the design, location, funding, execution of projects that, again, we know have impacts on the communities where those projects are being constructed. We think that there are positive benefits that can come from all those projects that will help those communities to be more resilient, to improve health equity and reduce some of the carbon impacts of those developments, if those moments of opportunity are seized. So the trick seems to be for us that we have to know that those moments are there and identify them and be prepared to act on them when that moment comes. So you probably, everyone's familiar with sort of the idea of being shovel ready for a funding opportunity. We think that there's just as much value in thinking about being shovel ready for equity. So next slide. So with the Just Growth portfolio, we have our circle, as we mentioned, that I think we're somewhere around 40 different organizations that are active in that, including a number of local community residents and frontline partner organizations. We have a number of different activities within our portfolio that go beyond and build on that Just Growth circle. And we think about this in a sense as a bit of an inside and outside game, if you will. We know that building capacity within community is really essential if we want community to be positioned to lift their voices, to act on moments of opportunity for equity, to demand accountability from their leaders and from private developers coming into their community. So we invest in a number of different tactics to help prepare and grow that capacity for community members. So that includes some of the leadership development work that Chandra alluded to. We have our Resident Leaders for Equity Academy. We're in the have had several cohorts go through that program. Right now we have a Regional Leaders for Equity program cohort that's in place. We have an East Point Leaders for Equity cohort that's running, and we will have a youth cohort beginning in January in the Carver High School cluster. We also have invested significantly in frontline organizations, both for their basic survival and supporting their ability to be an active partner and participate in civic opportunities, to bring folks together around development decisions. And also in this time, we have supported a number of these frontline partners, like the Community Movement Builders, which is the photo down in the right-hand corner, or no, I'm sorry, the bottom left-hand corner, is a representative of a building in their community. And they, like many others who are sort of frontline grassroots organizations in communities that are particularly hard hit by the COVID-19 pandemic, are shifting gears in many cases to not only continue their own work around anti-displacement work, but also providing critical relief supplies, testing, services, food, you name it. So we've been able to help bring in some support to help them help their communities, which we feel like is again part of that capacity building. We also invest a great deal of effort in trying to help build the local government capacity to implement equity practices and policies. We've done some gentrification system mapping within our circle in the last couple of years, and it helped us to just understand more deeply how so many different activities that occur in a community level are connected, and how certain forces move at a different pace than others, and how when you're looking at investments in infrastructure in particular, it's helpful to know that some of the balancing factors that can help a community retain in place need to be invested in long before that infrastructure investment is made in order to bear fruit. So we do a lot of work around training and leadership cultivation with local governments, and a lot of that is happening in a Zoom format right now. We're working on a couple of different decision support tools. We feel like that is a helpful area for us to be able to put some sort of tool in an elected official or a project manager's hands within a local government to to understand the equity implications of a project and where those moments of opportunity lay. And we do a significant amount of policy and practice research and analysis, both at sort of a broad scale, like things like transportation equity in the report that's down in the bottom right hand, as well as at a very micro scale for particular municipalities. Next slide, please. Oh, back one. I think I maybe hit the keys. Thank you. So this is one example, again, to follow Chandra's lead on a tangible piece of work that we've been involved in. And this is something that the Partnership for Southern Equity was one of several partners who all actually were very active in the Just Growth Circle. And I think in many ways, this Water Equity Task Force sort of emerged from the Just Growth Circle. This was a process that took a couple of years, working closely with the City of Atlanta's Watershed Management Division, with West Atlanta Watershed Alliance, folks from Eco Action, from American Rivers, the Conservation Fund, number of different folks. And we worked with a group of other task forces from several other cities around the country with a learning process to understand what different cities were doing and how these things were impacting communities. We helped to contribute to a roadmap that identified some key areas of focus for increasing equity in the way that that the water utility in Atlanta addresses their work. So shared equitable water decision making was something that emerged from that as a priority. Workforce development and climate resilience. So these were all things that had tremendous equity implications, and through these collaborative process and partnerships, we were able to help to build some new priorities into the action planning for this city agency with an enormous capital investment budget. So that was something that we're still a part of, but an exciting effort for us. Next slide, please. Thank you. And I'm going to sort of come into the close, talking for a few moments about our work with the city of East Point, and then I will hand it over to Mayor Holiday Ingram. Let me give a little bit of context for this work from PSC's perspective, and then of course you'll hear much more from her around what brought her to the moment of wanting to take this leadership position around equity. The City of East Point brought the Partnership for Southern Equity on as a consultant after an RFP process back at the beginning of 2020. And the idea was for us to approach a holistic planning process that would result in a strategic plan for equitable growth and inclusion for the City of East Point. Next slide, please. Oh, let me see. So the question of why focus on equity for a city like East Point makes a lot of sense to us, but it is probably worth sort of highlighting, if you're not familiar with the City of East Point, some of the forces at play that are impacting the city greatly right now. There's a tremendous amount of pressure for gentrification, a lot of great community assets. I know the mayor will share how the gem has been discovered, and so as the interest and demands on property values and demands that are impacting lots of communities are starting to intensify, it was, I think, a natural moment to step back and sort of question how are the residents being included in those processes, and how will they benefit from the growth that is coming. One critical issue that we know, again, will play a force in whether or not the current legacy residents have the ability to stay in the City of East Point long-term and benefit from all the new investment, is whether or not the housing that is affordable is protected, and how new affordable housing stock is developed. Right now, there's a great deal of affordable stock, but it is naturally occurring and not protected. And so I think there's some very wise thinking that now is the time to start to explore what those type of protections look like. The plan that we're focusing on has 3 major buckets of effort: inclusive housing, equitable industrial land use, and economic inclusion. So economic inclusion will encompass both the way that economic development is approached for the city of East Point, as well as how internal policies and practices related to procurement are approached. And equitable land use is something that, or equitable industrial land use, excuse me, is something that is a very timely question, given, again, the increased demand on the large inventory of industrial sites that exist in the city of East Point, as pressures related to airport infrastructure loom, as pressures related to mixed-use redevelopment loom. There's significant questions around highest and best use for the assets that the city has. And we're excited to see that leadership is really committed to setting some new expectations and standards for what we think of as being more high road development, that really demonstrates that there is a sense of fiscal stewardship, that they're not costs of a development that are going to unduly burden the taxpayers of the city of East Point, that there's environmental stewardship that is baked into new development. So knowing that there are environmental justice concerns from past operations, how do we help the city ensure that future operations moving forward are helping to mitigate potential environmental issues? And community stewardship. And this is really at the heart of the equity concern, is how do we ensure that the new development that is to come is done in a way that protects those who are there now, so that they can stay for the future benefits? And how do we ensure that things like job resources that may be really critical for residents in certain communities are factored in as a part of a binding agreement for community benefits? So these are all considerations that we're thinking about in this planning process. Next slide, please. So in our planning process, I wanted to just highlight, as I sort of wind down here, a couple of, or 4 different prongs of the way that we're approaching this. That is a slight differentiation from maybe a traditional planning process. We feel like if we're talking about a strategy for equitable growth and inclusion, it is absolutely essential that we're engaging those most impacted and least traditionally engaged in the work of planning in the city. So we have a number of different tactics that we're deploying, including going into community for listening sessions, doing canvassing at apartments. We have had a great deal of blast of some resources through digital and print. This is difficult work in COVID times in particular, and so I would be not truthful if I said that this was easy. And we have had some hits and had some misses, but it's something that we feel like is absolutely core to the process of developing an equitable growth and inclusion plan. And so it's something that we're deeply committed to at all stages of this process. We're doing a great deal of research and providing thought leadership to the staff in regular ongoing conversations with the staff, brought in some policy and practice innovations from other places through some panel discussions. We are also ensuring that resident leadership development is a core part of the leave behind from this process. And so we have an East Point Leaders for Equity Academy that is underway. And those individuals have already stepped up and committed to helping to be stewards into their own communities to help engage others. They are learning about power building, about organizing, about the development process, and where they might be able to intervene in different ways to support more equitable outcomes. And we really see that it's an 8-month process, and And ultimately, this is really long-term relationship building for the city, and ultimately becomes part of the accountability strategy for implementing the plan. And last but not least, we really want to be smart about leveraging a tremendous amount of momentum that's already happening. A couple of examples of that: there is a Georgia Initiative for Community Housing that the city has been successful in securing some support over the next 3 years to really look holistically at community housing, from inventorying to really identifying the most strategic opportunities for affordable and inclusive housing. So we know that we'll be feeding into that with our plan. There's a great deal of work happening with Aerotropolis, and we're definitely connected to them and looking for lots of opportunities to leverage the work that's happening there, particularly around their regional land use study and some of the great insights that they've been able to find in implementation that relates to East Point. And finally, the Willingham Corridor Livable Centers Initiative project that will be starting after the beginning of the year is something that will have a tremendous amount of engagement and deep planning work that relates to industrial land use in that that traditionally industrial corridor in the city. So another area that we'll be finding some synergy with moving forward. And last slide here. So wanted to lift up, in case it's maybe fuzzy for folks, what an equitable solution might look like in a plan like this. Here are just a few examples of things that I think will be considered. An ordinance that requires community benefits and environmental justice assessment to qualify for tax abatements. This is something that many other cities are starting to consider as a role for the local government, particularly when it comes to offering incentives for development. Procurement policy that provides additional access to contracts for firms meeting expanded local benefit criteria. So again, just one way that internal policy and practice can support more equitable outcomes. We know that the types of things that have to be conducted in order to see more equitable outcomes and more guarantees for inclusion and equitable growth cannot happen by the city alone. So partnerships will be critical to this. Partnerships with entities like land banks and land trusts that can help to transfer tax delinquent properties into community-owned assets that protect permanent affordability and create local jobs is one of the solutions that we're talking through. And then finally, utility policy, because East Point has its own water utility, there are tremendous opportunities there around prioritizing natural solutions that have maybe a greater ecosystem benefit than pipe solutions, and being able to require additional community engagement in the procurement process, different requirements that the city can enforce when they're expending their own dollars for different green infrastructure solutions. So those are just a few examples. And with that, I am going to sort of lift up this quote as I hand the mic over to Mayor Holiday Ingram. This is something that resonates greatly for all of us at PSC. That is a quote from the great James Baldwin, that one of the things that has always afflicted the American reality and the American vision is this aversion to history. History is not something you read about in a book. History is not even the past, it's the present. And so with that, I know Mayor Holiday Ingram has thoughts around the history of East Point and how that has led the outcomes to become what they are for residents in the city and created the opportunity for the leadership that she's seizing now. So I've got a last slide here with a tee off to Mayor Ingram.
Well, thank you so much, Suzanne. Thank you to the ARC and PSC, Nathaniel, and team for giving me this opportunity to just say a few words today. And so the quote from James Baldwin regarding history definitely frames where I want to start, because as I often say, I am Dina Holiday Ingram, mayor of the great city of East Point, where there's no point like East Point. And I say that because I believe that we are a model and will continue to be a model for all things equitable, just, fair, and inclusive. And where equity and inclusion is more than a cliche, it is actually what we do, how we live. It's in the fabric of our community and in our actions. But that's not where we've always been. And I think it's critically important that I just share briefly with you kind of the history of East Point as it relates to industrialization and housing, and then kind of why we are fired up and ready to go today, and totally committed to ensuring that we equitably revitalize and redevelop our city, because we know that gentrification is not synonymous with revitalization and redevelopment. Most people try to act like it is. You can totally revitalize a city in a way that respects its legacy residents and businesses through equity. And so, you know, a little bit about our history. East Point is a city that it has initial origins of being a connector. And so, but we also have initial origins of de jure segregation. On July 15th, 1912, the East Point City Council unanimously approved an ordinance that actually required all Blacks in the city of East Point to live in a certain area of the city, which was about 45 acres and is known today, and became known then as East Washington, our East Washington neighborhood. That neighborhood, and by choice, it was designed that the Blacks would live in this area. So at that time, the Blacks in the city were those who were living on or former descendants of enslaved people on the Connolly Plantation in the city of East Point. And then we also had some other African Americans that had come to the city from other areas like Noonan, Griffin, and Upson County. And so at that time, the requirement that they lived there, if the Blacks were living in any other area in the city, they either had to move to this location or move out of the city. And the location, so let's talk about it. It was immediately adjacent, right beside the mills in the city, a very industrial area. Three of the companies there, three of the companies were fertilizer plants. So you can imagine this odor that was emanating from those plants. In fact, the nickname was Stinktown during that time because of the odor and the other environmental contaminations that the residents in that area who were forced to live in that area under the color of law in the city of East Point had to endure. And so, you know, there also a period of vibrancy. They were made to live right by the factory so that the owners of the factories wouldn't have to worry about whether or not they'd be late to work, so that the owners of the factory also would be able to keep a close watch and eye on their employees at all times. And, you know, because there was a need for cheap labor, people from other areas of Georgia, other rural areas, came to this location because they wanted to get a job, and they felt like if you couldn't get a job anywhere else, you can get a job in East Point. So again, being known as the city of opportunity. But what's unique in that is that we were 16 years ahead of the state of Georgia, because the constitutional amendment to actually that permitted racial segregation zoning or segregated zoning within the state didn't get passed until 1928. So again, that was in 1912. Of course, the homes that people of color were required to live in at that time were not up to standard. There were shanties, as they were called, substandard housing at best. And those conditions existed through in 1957, the city of East Point received a grant under the Georgia Urban Redevelopment Law, but the funding was awarded and conditioned upon totally revamping the 45-acre area known as East Washington. And so that property, over a period of about 9 years, there was a massive demolition of not only of almost every resident that was there, every home that was there, but also all of the businesses. And the persons who were living there, they were only given 3 options as it related to housing. And so again, there was de jure segregation. They had to live in these areas. But at this point, which is known as urban renewal, when this came to fruition, they were given 3 options, and some chose to move in the downtown area of the city. Others were able to, if you could either keep your property that you had And if you were a property owner, you could remain there and have the city completely rebuild your home, which meant you'd be able to get plumbing and electricity, all of those things that weren't already in the home. You also, they could remain on the property and bring it up to county standards. In the event that they could not or did not have the finances to renovate their home, the federal government provided a home loan for them. And if they owned their homes and wanted to leave the community, they could sell their property to the city of East Point. And lastly, if they were renting, they could continue to rent, but move in one of the newly built government project apartments. And so those were their choices at that time. And that's kind of when the integration started to happen. But again, because of, or at the law and policy, public policy of the city of East Point, the government saying that these are your options, not your choice. And so understanding that history and understanding that we still, not only did we have that industrial area, we grew at the level of industrialization in our city. And there are other neighborhoods that are near industrial uses or industrial zone areas in our city. And so we've decided early this year in February, we paused, we implemented a moratorium to take a look at the industrial land use, to come up with more equitable industrial land use. As Suzanne mentioned earlier, what is the highest and best use? What is a use that is more compatible with the residents and their quality of life living there? And even though environmental standards and protections are regulated by the federal and state government, what is it that we can do to infuse environmental justice in whatever ordinances we have locally? And so PSC reached out to our East Point Environmental Collective to be able to harness the local residents who've already been working on trying to ensure a more environmentally just city. Our work initially started by being one of a part of the first cohort for the National League of Cities of Opportunity, Healthy People, Thriving Communities, looking at social determinants of health and looking at equity within our housing, within our economic opportunities and mobility within the city. And then knowing that, well, we are working on building a new model. We need to engage some experts that have this experience. We reached out to the Partnership for Southern Equity and began this work really intently at the beginning of this year. And so Suzanne has shared with you a number of strategies, a number of things that we are working on. I will tell you, I'll be quite honest, we are pretty much building a plane while flying, but we are committed. I am a mayor who serves on a city council with council members where the majority of those council members really understand the commitment to equity and the commitment to putting people over profits in politics and making sure that we are doing things in a way that is more equitable for our city, that allows our legacy residents and businesses to grow with us. We have had a summer of equity, learn and share, where we actually, even during COVID, we had Zoom big idea sessions on development and that benefits community, housing for everyone, environmental justice, building community wealth through small business innovation. And then we had in-person listening sessions to go around and hear from residents regarding the moratoriums that we had in place, the vision and things that we are working on as it relates to equity, and to hear from them. And so we had one in each of our 4 wards to be able to move that work forward. And so I won't rehash all of the other initiatives that Suzanne has shared in her previous slides, but I will say that, you know, doing this work, and I've spoken and been a faculty at a number of different equity workshops, and I tell people that when you commit to doing this work, sometimes people will make you feel like or think that you're crazy, like you're the only one who thinks this way and this can't be right. And, you know, why don't you just do it the way things have been done all along? And I say to those people that you're not crazy, you're courageous. And doing this work requires that level of courage to basically disrupt the model that exists. I believe that in East Point, we will either totally prevent gentrification of our city, but definitely minimize the negative impacts of it through equitable revitalization and redevelopment. And that requires courage, that requires commitment, that requires, you know, being willing to stand, even though people might not be able to see the long term right now, understanding that we didn't get into this overnight, we won't get out of it overnight, but with steady work in making constant steps on our journey. They may be small steps, some may be big, but if we continue to move forward, I firmly believe that we will be able to have a city where equity and inclusion is more than a cliche. It is actually a way of life, and it is actually a way that values the residents that are there as well, while we are attracting new residents and new people to the city to come and see why I say there's no point like East Point. So thank you again for the opportunity to share on this afternoon, be a part of this panel, and to talk about work that I'm really passionate about, that I firmly believe in, and that I know while it might be different, and it might not necessarily, we might not have all the answers now. If we believe, I'm a believer and not a doubter, and if we first believe that it is possible to do something different and then put actions to that, because faith without works is dead, we know that we will be the model city for equity and inclusion and build legacy equitable development projects within our city. So again, thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Mayor Holiday Ingram, for your leadership. Of course, along with your city council, just a deep commitment to realizing this equity strategic plan, which, for the record, is the first plan of its kind in the state of Georgia. I wanted to make sure that I articulated that, and that happened as a result of the leadership of the city of East Point. So I wanted to bring back all of the panelists, and we have one question that we have, and again, we're going to go until 3:45, and I think we're waiting on one additional panelist. There we go. So our first question is, what do you think is the first and foremost way to get started on an equity audit for a community? And Suzanne, you wanna start on that? Want to start that question?
Sure. Well, I think first and foremost, you've got to have sort of a parallel plan for looking at lived experience of residents and how they experience inequities, as well as identifying the data sources that can actually help you to see what are the inequitable outcomes and the disparities that are showing up in the data today. So I know that that there are lots of different ways that you can approach the data. I think that conversations where there is more listening than talking with residents is got to be a really important part of the first few steps of that process for a community. I think that would be the place I would start. Chandra, you want to jump in, or Nathaniel, add anything else to that?
Well, I was just going to say, Suzanne, this kind of leads into another question about, do you have metrics that your organization uses to determine that you're progressing towards equity? And I think that question kind of dovetails into what you were saying, that there aren't really generic indicators per se as it relates to whether we're advancing equity or not in community. It's really the community working with us to co-design those indicators, right? Working to ensure that the voices of community are not just at the table, but actually engaged in designing the plan and also developing the indicators. Of course, from a academic perspective, there are various indicators that we can utilize, but for us, we deeply believe that there are no better indicators, no greater indicators than the indicators that are created through a partnership with community. So I just wanted to make sure that I shared that. One other interesting question, someone said, how, as a white person of privilege, can I help convince other white people about the inequities in society? especially in terms of issues of economic development in the South, where that message isn't always welcome or known to everyday residents. Anybody want to touch on that?
Well, I mean, I can jump into that and say that first and foremost, I feel like that has to come from a dialogue. That can't be from you know, an accusation point. It has to be from a point that starts with a great deal of vulnerability and accepting culpability, and understanding that as a white person with privilege, that whether you had a hand in designing the system or not, or executing part of the system, that you're benefiting from the system, and understanding ways that you're benefiting from that system, and doing your homework to really understand the different dimensions of the system itself are really important. And then I think that you have to be able to have conversations with individuals who are in power positions, who do have privilege, who may see things differently, to really build a personal relationship where you can get to a point where those vulnerable conversations happen. They're not going to happen quickly and easily without some forethought, without some homework, and without some vulnerability. And that's just the way that we approach it.
I would like to just add, say thank you for being candid and for asking a very, I think, pertinent question. And I would encourage you to embrace your privilege and embrace the opportunities that you have, and show up in those spaces and be the voice, right? You be the voice that says, you know, things that I might say, but because the color of my skin, it might be like, well, that's just enough. She's just a Black female saying what Black people say, right? But as a white person, with the inherent privilege that brings, and the networks and the opportunity, being that person in the room to say it, like literally you can say the same message, give the same statement that I have made, but they will hear it different and it will be accepted different. And you might actually be able to help enlighten others because they'll feel more comfortable having those conversations with you. But I always encourage people, like, I don't want anybody to be anything other than you are. You can't be Black if you're white, and I can't be white because I'm Black, right? And there are assets, there are benefits to both. And the path forward for us, we talk about allyship, right? The path forward requires having allyship, in that we all are harnessing our talents, our gifts, our networks, our resources for a common goal, which is to have a more equitable and inclusive community, starting where you are, what's within your locus control, and then being a model. I believe as East Point becomes a model, other people will be able to have a visual to see that it is possible. But I appreciate that, but own it and use it to further the work.
Chandra, did you have any thoughts? Oh, you're on mute. There you go. Uh-oh, we lost you again. Try one more time.
I echo both. Mayor Ingram, you know, particularly, and Suzanne, you know, speaking from that perspective, I believe 100% white people have to talk to white people and have these difficult conversations. And one of the things, you know, about our work at PSC, when we both talked about the equity circles and what we do in our leadership development, is about creating safe space. These are tough conversations because these are really personal conversations, because we are really having to deal with things that maybe we don't really want to think that we might internally feel, or that we might really want to think that we don't think that way. So I think, you know, just being, you know, like Mayor Ingram said, we just have to be who we are, and find those spaces that we trust to have those safe conversations, and be courageous. Like we talk about this a lot, right? These are tough. We have to be courageous to move forward, to have these tough conversations so we can move forward.
Mm. So Mayor, I do have a question for you, and I'm going to try to get at least 2 questions out before we adjourn. You always hear me say that equity is both a journey and a destination. And of course, we've been so honored to be on this journey with you and East Point in advancing equity. What lessons have you learned along the way with us, since we began this journey, that you would want to elevate to other elected officials or other governmental people who are interested in that journey and may not necessarily have a guide in thinking about that journey? Are there any reflections or lessons that you could impart to them?
So, I think the lesson is to make sure that you're continuing to have consensus along the way, and to be flexible, right? So again, this is new. And we are building the plane while flying, but the fundamental, you have to believe that it's possible, and you have to commit to doing the work. But the work definitely evolves, right? And how we think we may have, the ABCD plan that may have initially started ended up we had to be very flexible because of what is happening right now, what was happening at the time in our city, and being willing to pivot, to be able to make sure that as you're doing this work, that you are making it unique to your community, that you are creating spaces to listen to your residents in the community, and that you're building the capacity of your residents at the same time that you're building the capacity of yourself and your staff. And so our Equity Leaders Academy, I am extremely excited about that. We have 20 residents, 5 from each ward. We have 4 wards, 5 from each ward, but knowledge is power. And the reason why things continue the same way that they have continued for so long is because of lack of knowledge, because people don't understand that there's a different path forward. So I would definitely say, first, you have to commit to the work. We started with a resolution, just basically committing and stating clearly our public commitment and our public policy belief as it relates to how important it is for us to implement equity within our city. Then we had to engage experts in the way I thought the work might look moving forward. And even the way that it looked when we initially engaged them, things happen because the world doesn't stop. Development doesn't stop in your city. People, developers don't try to stop coming to your city. Things aren't gonna just pause really because you're doing the work, but you have to be committed even when those things are happening, to say, we're still working on a plan, but we're going to articulate and voice and make clear our expectation and commitment to that, and be willing to be bold and courageous. Some people might say you're crazy. I say you're courageous. It's the other C. To be able to be committed to move forward.
Thank you, Mayor. I think that is a great way to end our time together. Again, I want to take the time to thank the Atlanta Regional Commission, Doug Hooker, Mike Alexander, Melissa, for providing an opportunity for us to share our work. And we will continue to drive and push for equity in this region. And we definitely always invite opportunities for collaboration and new friends who are committed to working with us to ensure that a child's zip code, that it doesn't have more influence on their life outcomes than the dreams that they have in their hearts. And we believe that it's possible with the support and partnerships that need to be and have to be realized in order to create that brighter tomorrow. So again, thank you so much, Atlanta Regional Commission, for this opportunity. Mayor Holiday Ingram, the Honorable Mayor Dina Holiday Ingram, thank you so much for participating. And of course, Chandra and Suzanne, thank you for your leadership. And for the participants, thank you so much for sharing your time with us. and hopefully we'll see you all real soon. Take care.